All right, it's so wonderful to see all of you here today. I'm so glad that we have so many people who've joined to learn more about this very important issue, classroom challenges for the international student during COVID-19. Chris and I have worked really closely together during the pandemic to figure out solutions for international students. Chris is over there in ISS and works lots with immigration and with students who are not in their first year, generally if they're undergraduate students. And I work in the International Accelerator Program, and we work with students who are in their first year. Our program is primarily undergraduate international students, but we certainly seek to serve the entire international student population here at USC. We did this presentation for the first time in fall 2020, and I'd really hoped that the time had come to not have to discuss this topic anymore. Unfortunately, there are still challenges there for the international students at USC and around the US and around the world. And so we're talking about it again today. I would love to ask the group about your experience with international students during the pandemic. Did you teach international students in fall 2020 or in spring 2021? And if so, what challenges did your international students experience? Not being able to see their families for extended periods of time? Absolutely. I can see we have some personal experiences too here.
You're hitting lots and lots of topics.
Definitely. Certainly while the university was operating virtually, most international students were studying from their home countries. Some were here and were studying virtually, but were on campus if they were already here before the pandemic hit, but then they had very long periods of time without any ability to see their families back home. Other students were studying virtually. We had a number of students who were studying virtually from the other side of the world, so 12-hour time difference in many cases, and this was incredibly challenging. There were internet issues for students who were studying virtually that US students, maybe they also experienced some difficulties, but there were certainly unique issues related to accessing coursework virtually. We do still have students who are studying virtually from their home countries. The offerings at USC are much smaller, a much smaller set of offerings, I would say. We have an unusual number of students taking a leave of absence this fall while they are back in their home countries. And yes, these are all issues I'm seeing here in the chat. I think you touched on a lot of the different problems, and we will review some of these. Some of the situations have changed, some of the circumstances have improved. However, we have not seen a full recovery of our international student population at USC, and there are still challenges there, and there will be residual challenges because students have had to take leave of absence or have had to study virtually, and so we'll be talking about all those topics today.
Right. Earlier today, I was talking with Sherry, and I said the theme for today's presentation should be, it's getting better, but we're not there yet. So we've definitely seen improvements, but none of these problems have gone away.
Absolutely. Okay, so you'll see here the list of different challenges. Before we start to get into these different areas that have been challenging for students and still continue to be challenging for students, I'm going to show you a little bit about the recovery that we're seeing and the continued issues by the numbers. So in fall 2019, you can see the numbers there. We had 566 new students and a total of 1,800 students. Fall 2020, you can see how dramatically that number reduced, especially with the new students. We saw a lot of students graduate that year, and then new enrollments were not there because we had so few new students coming in. Also in fall 2021, you can see that that number is a bit closer to the numbers in fall 2019. However, that number of new students is primarily graduate student enrollment rather than undergraduate student enrollment. The undergraduate student numbers have still not recovered. And I see some folks in the group today that are from the School of Business and HRSM. And these are the two colleges who would be noticing this the most, I would think, because 56% of our graduates so far are graduates from the School of Business. And the two colleges that are most represented are the School of Business and HRSM at the university. And so those colleges are likely to be really noticing some challenges there with students returning. Maybe students were admitted to the business school at the end of the spring semester, and then they're taking leave of absence this fall, and they didn't enroll yet in their coursework for the fall. So these kinds of things you are very likely to have seen if you're from one of those colleges. But then it needs to be said that across the board, there are international students in every college at USC, and students are impacted all over. What we're finding to a large extent is that parents are not comfortable sending their undergraduate students abroad. International students who had TA-ships, GA-ships who were financially supported, they figured out a way to come back to the US.
Graduate students tend to be older, are going to be making more of their decisions, while undergrad students are definitely still under the heavier influence of their parents making decisions. And so, yes, I think we've seen a lot more movement in grad students, PhD.
So we took a look at the students who were enrolled in spring 2020, but are not enrolled in fall 2021. We don't have a documented reason for that. So they don't have a graduation to point to. There's no transfer to another university. Those sorts of factors are not included there. So you can see here the distribution of the percentages of students across different nationalities. Now, I should point out that for undergraduate students, China is the most strongly represented nationality. However, the percentage of Chinese students who are impacted and are not back after the pandemic is certainly larger than the total percentage of students from China at USC. And so they are disproportionately impacted. And we're seeing a lot of those students either take a leave of absence this fall or wanting to study virtually this fall and maybe not being able to take a full course load. And certainly a much smaller number of students who have started at USC this fall from China. Looking specifically at admission-related impacts for students, you may be aware that right when the pandemic hit, the test centers around the world for GRE, for TOEFL, IELTS, those are the English language proficiency tests that they take, those were closed, and those were not accessible to students. We've seen those reopen in some cases, and we've also seen a lot of remote options become available. But those remote options are not available everywhere, and they've been very available here in the U.S., for example. But in China, we've seen it not be quite as accessible. So students are just not able to take those tests that they need to take in order to actually complete their application to USC. High schools and universities, I'm still hearing of those being closed, and that makes it difficult for one thing, for students to get their final grades from their completion of a degree, and also for them to get their official transcripts. And so we've definitely seen cases of that. It's not nearly as bad as it was in 2020, but it's definitely still happening. And also TAs and GAs are impacted if they're not able to reach the country. And so, as I mentioned before, if students are on one of those, they were forced, they really needed to come back into the country to have their TA-ship or their GA-ship. And so they made a way to do that in many cases, but that means that they've been separated from their families for a long time in many cases because of those travel constraints that we've seen.
Okay, so immigration challenges. Now, again, as we've said several times, these are getting better, and we have seen a lot more mobility, as you saw with those growing numbers. People can travel a lot more, but last summer, the SCVP guidance, which is the regulations and that ISS and all the immigration offices around the country use, was very confusing. It was changing a lot. So if you were working with international students, you likely were hearing some of that. Now it's settled down a little bit now, but there's still some changes. Where the country is in a strange place right now because some universities are working in their working with regulations that are back to pre-COVID times. So we're following a certain amount of rules and regulations that the federal government had, but then some other universities, if they haven't gone back offline, if they're still operating largely online and virtually, they're still operating in the post-COVID regulations, and it does cause some confusion, I think, at least on a higher level among immigration folks. There's conversations in NASA discussion boards and stuff, and there's a lot of different opinions right now. But for the university, for USC, I think that we've kind of settled in, and I think most students are finding it a little more easy to understand now. But it's certainly has been challenging for the last year. There's still some holdover for some confusion on that, and honestly, it could change again. We don't really know what is coming. Still, it seems like we're trying to get back to a new normal, but what is the new normal's not going to be normal, whether that's for our students or for the university or for teaching. Just personally, I'm sitting in my home right now because my child's school closed for a week because 40% of the teaching staff has been exposed to COVID and are quarantined now. It's this is the new world, and so this is the same world that the guidance could be coming back to us, so we don't know. We do have students that are still trying to get visas. Visas for the last year have been very hard to get because one of the first things that really shut down and started impacting the international students is embassies and consulates around the world closed. So they might have had some of the pieces to get here and ready to go, but if they couldn't get that visa, they couldn't come. And so that was a huge impact. We're seeing a lot more students get visas. There's a lot more mobility. We're also seeing students that have visas travel a little bit. We had a lot of students traveling this summer when they couldn't do it last summer because they had valid visas. So while certainly this is not solved, there are up until recently, there's still been lots of waiting lists because not only did you have the normal number of students that were trying to get their visas this year, but you had an entire previous year of students when those visa appointments opened up at the embassies. You had this backlog that came in too. So Sherry was showing me a website earlier today. The waiting time for visas in a lot of places is a lot less than it has been. But we still have places that students just couldn't make it. We had students that were trying, and they've decided that they can't make it now. They've deferred until spring. They're trying to be remote. It's still an issue, but hopefully with everything opening up, this will be less and less of a problem. They can be distance ed, or they can be late arrivals. So technically we could still have students arriving more for graduate students. I already mentioned that there's a lot of students that are opting for leave of absence. That's because last year they could have just signed up for classes, but the university, when it went back to normal, really limited the number of online classes that are offered, and that has caused a lot of students to just be unable to find enough classes to satisfy their degrees that they're looking for. And then international student admission and mobility has not recovered for some countries have had more luck getting back on their feet than others, and I think that's already been touched on by Sherry. So we're a lot better off, but there's a lot more challenges to go.
Yeah, and I think Chris has already touched on this a little bit actually, and as Chris mentioned, I think that it's very clear that the situation with most embassies has changed, but the change just happened a little bit too late for students who are trying to get here for the fall in some cases. I know we still have one student who is going to have to come halfway through the semester because his visa appointment was canceled and it was restarted a little bit later. So he's got a new appointment, but it's going to bring him very late. And so we've seen isolated situations like that have sort of produced the need to be very creative in trying to get students here. But those types of solutions are really rare to find because there really are not very many virtual options, and the ability for a student to join a face-to-face class after starting virtually, it's very, very difficult to do that right now. So those are just some of the challenges that have impacted our new student enrollment this semester, and it may mean that we have a higher than normal intake in the spring, more students than usual starting their degrees in the spring, but that of course will depend on how things progress and watching that case rate go down. I'm going to shift the focus a little bit now away from the new student enrollment to students who have been isolated during the pandemic. And I want you to try to think about the experience of the international student, just the student in general, but thinking about maybe the difference between a domestic student who is isolated in this pandemic situation versus an international student who is isolated in this pandemic situation. What do you think the differences would be for those groups of students? How do you think their experience might be different? Yes, the support for students, if they're here and they're not with their families, then that can be more challenging for students, absolutely. Transportation can be a big issue if students don't have their own means of transportation and they're isolated here, absolutely. Yes, I mean, food is a hugely comforting part of our everyday lives. If you can't find the food that you love, then that's going to make you feel more isolated culturally, makes you experience culture shock to a deeper degree, absolutely. Looking at the way different countries are handling the pandemic, comparing that, watching your own media in your own country, and maybe you are seeing an accurate depiction of what's going on in the other country, maybe you are not. We have a little bit of a filter in a lot of our news sources, and that's certainly the case worldwide. So it's certainly a challenge.
What Joshua just said, domestic students go home, that's a big one, and that's actually something that we have constantly, we feel very supported by student health services, but that's definitely something that we've kind of gone back and forth on, because yeah, for this year, there was a lot of discussions about like, oh, well, everybody has to do their COVID plan and then they'll just go home, but we're like, no, like we don't have, our students can't do that. And so they did have to kind of make some allowances for what happens when students have to quarantine. So that's a big one that I think is easy to overlook sometimes when you're planning logistics.
Yeah, I mean, here, we see the case rate going up and we see, yes, that's very concerning, but at the same time, we also know that we have great safety measures here at the university and that we've managed to keep things pretty safe here. And that's what we conveyed to our students, but the news is definitely telling a very different story than maybe what we see. But we are in a challenging situation. And, it's very helpful to have the vaccine available here at USC to all students who are coming in. But there also has been some fear around the vaccines offered in the US from some students and from some specific populations out there also, that it's not a very safe vaccine. So it's been challenging as well, not only for students to get the vaccine, but also for everyone to feel like it's a safe option, since that certainly is the recommended method of making sure that everyone is safe and can resume to normal operations. So thank you so much for sharing your ideas in the chat about differences that you would certainly expect for isolation. If students are here in the US, yes, they do experience all those issues. This is something that we find a great deal. I'm going to talk about one factor that has not been mentioned yet, actually, and that's linguistic related. So if students are isolated, especially if they're isolated in their home country, you certainly find a deterioration in the proficiency in English. And because they're coming here and they're engaged in English when they're studying, they have to engage in English to actually do their coursework. That's caused an issue for many students just in studying virtually and not being fully immersed in English while they are studying from their home countries. It makes it harder for them to make the same gains that they would normally make in their English proficiency development. Also, when students go on a leave of absence and they're not immersed in English, it makes it a little bit of an even bigger hurdle to come back and to feel that they can be confident with their coursework after being away for for a period of time. And so I think you are likely to see more challenges of English proficiency in your classrooms. I definitely noticed this semester that we had a larger than normal percentage of students who came in with an admission test score for their English proficiency. And then when we tested them on arrival, as we always do, we had more students who were placing significantly lower than what that English proficiency test would have shown. And I really think that it's just because of this extended period of isolation and the lack of opportunity to interact with other peers in English and to be able to do that. So also in your classrooms, you may be finding issues with students really just understanding because of the masks, because it's difficult if you can actually see the lip movements of your professor to understand things. And so this makes it more important, I think, this semester in particular, to provide support for students on an English proficiency kind of a level. And I'm going to talk later about some tips for making your content a little bit more accessible to students who are struggling to kind of catch up with their English proficiency. There is support in the Student Success Center for students. There's one-to-one tutoring. If you find that a student is struggling with English and they're already degree seeking, then I would love for you to email me so that we can reach out to that student and address that. We do have English tutors specifically available to students who are in their first year, but we are also aware that this year we may need to make those resources available more broadly. And so we'd love to know if you're finding that students need extra support specifically for English proficiency. A lot of times the one-to-one tutoring offered by the Student Success Center is going to be really effective in helping out students just to review content and to help walk them through things like supplemental instruction, the writing center. The staff in those offices are aware of international students and their linguistic needs, and they're ready to help with that sort of thing. So
from an immigration side of things, we don't see this very often. It's not just an easy, you just ask for it and you get it kind of thing. But one of the ways that a student can be officially under-enrolled, all full-time students have to be on an F1 visa, have to be full-time enrolled, which is 12 hours for undergrad, 9 for graduate, or 6 with graduate with an assistantship. But one of the ways that a student can be under-enrolled is if they are having legitimate language issues. Now, I have not heard of this happening very much in the graduate levels and some of the degree seeking, but it is something that could be done. So if you are seeing a student that is really truly struggling and not understanding, you can also, like Sherry said, you can alert Sherry, you can alert me. Like Sherry and I talk a lot, so if it ends up being not exactly one of our students, we're happy to get it to the right place. That's something that generally happens in the beginning of like the first semester. They can make that allowance, but we're in a very unique situation that we've never been in before, where we have students that might be coming in as sophomores or PhD students that are 1 year into their classroom work that then arrive that may not have as strong as English as we expected to be, or that they would have because of some of the deterioration. So it's a very unique time where we've got students that are well into their programs that are also just on campus for the first time. So just keep that in mind. It's like I said, it's not just a simple request and then you get it granted. There's a process that has to go through it, but that is something that from a federal level that an exception could be made for students that are struggling with language as well. There's a lot that's happened since COVID started. I think that's an understatement. There's a lot that has happened. And I'm going to talk about some of these points broadly. Changing immigration guidance and regulations. Again, last year was a roller coaster. If you remember all the stuff that the first in July of last year that said, oh, if the university's not back to face-to-face, then the student has to leave the country or transfer regardless of whatever happens. It was a nightmare scenario. Obviously, it got thrown out within like a week. But so all of the guidance that has been changing, it has been a lot, and it's been stressful, very stressful for students. We're in a different political administration now. there's still a lot going on. China and the U.S. still have a lot of tensions there. In the last year, the U.S. shut down a consulate in Texas, and then China immediately shut down a U.S. consulate, or one of the embassies that are there, shut that down. It's kind of a tit for tat. So there's that's still happening, not as bad as it was last year when everything was kind of more chaotic. But and then things like the use of the China virus instead of COVID-19, that was very political, and we can tell you for a fact that we had students that were very upset by that. They felt very insulted. Honestly, it was an insult. Like, I'm not going to go into politics, but like, that was very purposefully done. So it upset some of our students. And then, even though I don't know if you're like me, I feel like since COVID started, my ability to gauge time has completely gone out the window. Things that seem like it just happened were years ago, and things that, I just have a hard time. So when COVID was happening, it was also last summer, the major summer of racial unrest, which was also upsetting and concerning for students and their parents. Now, certainly things have settled down a bit in that area. Obviously not solved, but I feel like COVID, while there's still discussions in the news about race in the United States, as there should be, COVID seems to be dominating most right now. But so this goes back to what was said earlier about trying to gauge like the news that parents are hearing versus news that is being said in the United States. And not only that, like what's actually on the ground. I've seen pictures of, buildings on fire and people running and craziness, and like, well, yes, that did happen, but the United States is huge, and that did not happen in Colombia. And so that's a challenge to fight against that. And there's definite propaganda at play for political use. Now, this picture that I have right here, this was put on the major social network, basically the official social network arm of the Chinese government last year. It is you can see, very ominous. This is the Statue of Liberty with explosions. That's the White House down there. And if you look at the picture here, the Statue of Liberty's arm is, the statue is shattering away. That's a pretty broad, pretty bold statement there. And that's the type of politics and propaganda that was being spread against the U.S. This is just the background that, like, on top of just like, are we going to be safe, and how are our classes going to be, and how do I enroll for classes, and can I get the class that I need to progress? All of these things, this is the background that's happening in different countries, and it's been a lot for our students. And I know a lot of them, like we said, their parents are like, no, you're not going, and they're calling them back, or they're missing. Personal, we've already talked about this, but we've definitely seen increased rates of anxiety, whether those are students that are here and unable to go home, which we definitely had. I had one student, it was actually one of the IEP students, that was talking to me, and he told me that he was very depressed because he was not from a very wealthy family, but his roommate was, and his roommate was able to secure a plane ticket, and he was not, because it cost thousands of dollars. He was very upset about that, and so he was very concerned about what was happening at home, not being able to get there. We've just seen this across the board from students. Financial stress, what I just said was a perfect example. Also, economies got really walloped by COVID, and not all of them have recovered to the same extent. And so you might have somebody that comes here much more financially comfortable, and then suddenly COVID hits, and currency devalues. There's people lose jobs, somebody gets sick, and suddenly the financial stress is much more prominent than it was before. You also have students that had been working. This goes back to what Sherry mentioned earlier about TAs and grad assistantships and teaching assistantships. You had students that were counting on that. That's how they were going to pay. They were going to pay for their classes through that work. They found out they couldn't come because they couldn't get a visa, and then because of decisions made at the university level, based on like tax regulations, they were told that they could not work. So they could not work overseas on their assistantships, and so suddenly they had no financial resources. So that's a huge thing. Depression relating to isolation, I think it seemed like in the chat section, everybody had really good examples of that. Yeah, we know this is true. Whether they don't know anybody, whether it's linguistic, whether there's nothing to do. I mean, last year for sure, I mean, things have opened up maybe more than they should have as it stands right now. But last year, there was nothing going on. And we definitely had issues of students that we were not aware of their situations until their situations were really bad. Some serious mental health concerns arising, and everybody was kind of thrown off and like, how was there no red flags on this? But the fact is the teachers that could give us red flags weren't seeing them. They weren't hanging out with anybody that could also see this. We weren't seeing them because we were working from home and our office wasn't open for walk-ins. So it was the isolation and mental health toll was real and continues to be. It's a little better again as a lot more students are coming and campus is much more come to life. But if you're not living on campus and don't have easy transportation, it can be a challenge. Regular culture shock. Normally students come over here, they may have some culture shock in their first semester, can last longer than that. It can be in waves, but they get here and it's normally in their first time that they're here. But again, we have interesting situations where students may be several semesters into their studies, into their programs that are maybe getting into some of the more difficult times, more into research, and then they're suddenly having culture shock because they haven't been here before. And then we added this bulletin here, COVID culture shock. It looks very different on how it's being handled around the world. And the US is definitely, I mean, it's very political, and I'm not going to get into it, but the way that we handle things, like there's a lot of people that get here and are very shocked that we're not in masks and that large crowds are gathering, and it's just very different around the world. Vaccines are different, so we've gotten a lot more people have gotten vaccinated in the US than other countries that haven't had access to it, but we still have a lot of people that don't want it. And so not only is it just general culture shock, but the how to function in a new culture while also trying to function within COVID is a big deal, and it can be a big strain on our students as well.
I would love for you guys to just share things that you think may be a factor what would affect learning this fall. What do you think? How might these factors affect learning? Trouble focusing, absolutely. There's a lot of stress, and I think that we find that students across the university are feeling stressed. But there certainly are increased stresses because students are having to study so far away from their support networks and don't sort of have ready methods of interacting with others if they haven't had the opportunity to be here face-to-face prior to the pandemic. The shock of being back in class and anxiety associated, absolutely.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you. I would also like to say that what you're putting up here is great, but this also goes both ways. Trouble focusing. I'm in the same job in the country that I grew up in my first language, and I've had trouble focusing over the last year. The shock of being back in a class and the anxiety associated. Teachers and staff are feeling that as well. International students used to wearing masks may not want to work closely. Well, that goes the other way as well. I had some international students that did not have masks on the other day, and a volunteer for a program walked in the room, looked around, said, "Can I talk to you in the hallway?" and came back, and he said, "If they're not in masks, I'm out of here." And so I made sure everybody had masks on, but that was a USC student that was like, so all of this I think applies to everybody. It's been just a hard time. I think we're all doing exceptionally well, by the way.
These are all great ideas. Absolutely. The vaccine access is an issue. It affects students' comfort level, I'm sure, in the classes, or their desire to just stay totally isolated until they get their second dose would completely make sense. I think it's a very good point that the adjustment from the online learning to in-class learning is a big one. We have some students who spent their entire first year entirely online, and now they're coming to the country, and as Chris mentioned before, they're experiencing culture shock now, even though they've been in these classes for a year, and a lot of that support that we provided them in the first year that this is the time they need it. So we're providing more support for students who are in their second year now, and Chris is working with that a good bit, but certainly greater needs relating to just acculturation because students have started virtually. It's difficult to cover the course content, and that's very interesting that Kelly, that you say that it's hard to cover the same content in the classroom versus the way that it was online. Yeah, I mean, the adjustments are happening across the university. Just that shift is certainly a challenge that we're all experiencing. That's a good point. Yes, and that's a very good point, Michelle, that there is a strong focus on the first year student. And now that we have students who are returning to the university as second year students and they haven't had that first year support, we're having to kind of shift our methods a little bit, and that's uncomfortable. And I definitely understand just feeling a lack of focus right now because of COVID, and you know, things are not totally over, and so that certainly makes sense. Absolutely. All right, I'm going to move over to classroom tips. So if you do notice any serious language proficiency concerns in your classroom, please feel free to contact me. You can also direct students to, if they're undergraduate students, to the Student Success Center. They have excellent support there, and if they find that there's a serious language proficiency concern, they will communicate with me about it, and we'll work out solutions for them. Mild language proficiency concerns can be addressed by supporting students in the classroom. I'm going to share with you a link to a resource that was created by Reid, who is our Assistant Academic Director here at IAP. It is called Tips on Communicating with International Students. So a lot of this is somewhat common sense, but some of it is really, really helpful if you're not used to interacting with international students. Just thinking about how to handle things like cultural references, providing written support for the content that you're delivering so that they get the information in multiple modalities. I know that in some classes you're delivering the information in your lectures, but it may be quite different from the textbook, and so that written support for what information you are providing is really helpful. I also want to just throw out there that if a student asks if they can record your lecture on an MP3 player or something like that, it's of course entirely up to you. You shouldn't feel pressured to do that, but in some cases it's really helpful for students if they're just struggling with the transition back to this in the classroom learning environment where they don't have as much written support and visual support for what they're learning. So that certainly is helpful. Fostering communication in your classroom is important. Expect stress, show compassion, be supportive. I think what I've seen is a common theme in your comments in the chat is that you all seem to be really keenly aware of the amount of stress that students are experiencing right now, and I'm sure that I see that there are many graduate students in the room, many international undergraduate and graduate students rather in the room as well, and I know that all of you have probably experienced all of this and know just what it's like, and that gives you a really powerful and helpful position to be in the classroom, knowing what students are experiencing and understanding how their stress is compounded if they're studying so far away from home and they're not in a culture that they grew up in. These certainly multiply those stress levels that we see. And when you notice a red flag, please let us know. We are back to the scenario where we're face-to-face finally. We have support resources here on campus that are more readily available to students. We have options for students to have appointments virtually if they need it, whether it be for some sort of advising, mental health support, whatever it may be. We have all that available, but please speak up if you notice a student who needs some extra support, and when in doubt, refer out. And thinking about all these different factors, all these different challenges that students are experiencing, the residual effects of having been virtual for such a long period of time, what do you think you will change about the way that you teach or support international students this fall? I'm just going to throw out there, this is a challenging question because I feel like when we have sessions like this, we're already talking to individuals who are maybe already doing things that are very helpful for international students, or have maybe already begun certain practices with their international students they think would be helpful. So I'm going to broaden this question just a little bit. And what do you think would be helpful for a teacher to do or professor to do in the classroom? Great. Yes, being more aware and pointing towards appropriate resources, absolutely. Recording lectures for review is excellent, absolutely. Especially early on in the semester, it's helpful to do that until a student really gets the sense of the way that you convey information. It's helpful to do that for the first few, as long as you let the students know that you're not going to do it for the whole semester, if that's what you would prefer. But that definitely makes it possible for students to just review if they find that they didn't catch something, or they need more review. Hands-on learning and application. This is the point in the semester where students start to really get a sense of what your expectations are in the classroom. This is that moment when they get their first assignments back and they say, oh, okay, now I see what the professor was looking for. And so make sure you take advantage of that moment in your classrooms. Make sure you give an assignment early, if possible sometime this week, even if it's a really brief quiz or something, just to make sure that students are grasping what you're looking for and that they understand your expectations. Great. It's really helpful to see all of your comments here about just being more sensitive to students, and expecting stress, and accommodating as appropriate there. That's very true. Yeah. So it does depend on the instructor as far as whether they're comfortable posting things on YouTube. If students are studying from their home country, and we certainly found this a lot last year, then they may have a real challenge with certain ways that videos get shared. But it is very helpful to have that subtitle feature on YouTube for sure. And I'm going to go to the next slide where you'll see important contacts. So this is the website for International Student Services. This is my email address. The Student Success Center, as I mentioned before, is very helpful for undergraduate students. Writing Center is not mentioned down here. The Writing Center is also an excellent resource for students. The Peer Writing Center over at the Student Success Center, those appointments will often help students to talk through and understand the content, maybe understand the assignments that they're working on. They have success consultations available that will help students to kind of get through their syllabus or understand feedback if that's something that they need. So very, very helpful resources. And they're not just available for first year students, they're available for students throughout their times, and graduate students here. Is ISS available for Pomona College? This is a question for you, Chris, I think.
Yes, actually. For those campuses, we actually handle the immigration for those students. They don't have many international students there. They tend to be athletes that are at those campuses, but we've actually seen a few more than normal coming in this year. Again, maybe it's 2 years worth of students all coming in at the same time, but yes, we handle that. For the other the degree granting ones, so Aiken, Upstate, those handle their own immigration, but they oftentimes talk to us if there's any strange situations, since we tend to see more than they do. But for those 3 campuses, they do their own. But yes, the other ones, we handle that as well. If you see anything of concern or just have a question, just email us. Like, we're here to support our students, but supporting our students is equally as important as to what we may be doing for the students. But we want to make sure that you have the resources that you need in order to make our campus the most welcoming campus and supportive campus as well. So really, anytime that you have a question about something that maybe triggers a little flag in your mind, please reach out and contact us. And you can contact Sherry, you can contact me. Again, we're all on the same floor. We're all sister offices under Global Carolina. So if you get one of us and it's not quite the person that you need to talk to, we'll get you to where you need to be. We're really here to support you. I want to really stress that. I've been in presentations before where people have started asking all these questions and they were just like, we had no idea that y'all would help us with that. But we're here to help everybody. We want to make this the best place for our international students. So if that's helping you, that's great.
That's a very good point. Yes, we do have students from all over the world. Absolutely. Chris, do you know off the top of your head how many countries are represented
I
here at
don't
USC?
know. I don't know what this year would be yet because they're still compiling that, and last year not a good indication. So I will skip back 2 years pre-COVID. Fall 2019, we had 97 different countries represented. So obviously, if we had, I forget what the exact number was that you had up there, but like 1,800 and something, 700 and something were from China. Sometimes one of those countries is that we have like one sole person representing their country, but that's still somebody from representing their own country and their own culture. And so yeah, 97 different places, different countries. So that's a very good point. They're from all over.
It's always a challenge when we start talking about a group of people and generalizing about them. And I want to say that that when you talk about an international student, the only thing that really defines an international student is the fact that they're here on a visa. They're not a U.S. citizen, and
Right.
so it could be. There are so many students from different countries. We do have certain populations that are more heavily represented here at USC, but we strive to make sure that every single individual who's an international student is supported. And we often are, we have greater concerns for those students who are from populations that are less represented, because we want to make sure that they make the connections here in Columbia and they can feel that they have a community. And so, it's always wonderful to meet students from other cultures, but when you're really stressed, it's nice to have a buddy from your own country often who you can really be a peer with. So we know how valuable that is for students, and I know that Chris works to connect students with others. There are a ton of international student and nationality focused organizations here at USC. There are lots of different pocket communities with different nationalities, and lots of opportunities to connect. We actually have a really strong international student population and international population in general in Columbia. And so there are a lot of resources out there for students, and we want to make those connections for students if we can.
I appreciate you making that comment about identifying people by looking at them, because this is Sherry and I, this is our like wheelhouse. This is our area where we like work with international students, but like I can fall into that too sometimes. We have to remember that like China's a huge country. So China, the difference between someone from northern China and southern China is very different. Just like the difference between North US and southern US is very different as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for your contributions today. We as I mentioned, I know I mentioned it a lot, but I'll say it again. We're here to support all of you and what you do. We're so glad that you came today, and that you care about this topic. Students from everywhere in the world are welcome here at USC, and we want to make sure that they're comfortable.